After 2 weeks on the road, I was finally home. You'd think I'd be used to it by now, those grueling business trips that seemed to stretch forever, living out of a suitcase in sterile hotel rooms, the days blending into each other like a bad dream. I'm an architect, and it's not the glamorous job people think it is. It's long hours, stressful clients, and the constant pressure of making sure every blueprint, every corner, every damn line is perfect. But it pays the bills, and it gave Sarah, my wife, the life she always wanted. Or so I thought. Sarah and I had been married for 7 years, together for 9. She was beautiful, captivating, really, with her dark hair that framed her face like a painting, her bright green eyes that could light up a room or tear me apart in a single glance. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, a job she could do from home, which I envied sometimes. She'd be in her studio, hunched over her desk, the smell of paint and ink filling the air, a mess of colors on her hands, and that intense look on her face, as if she were solving the world's greatest mystery. I loved watching her like that, absorbed, lost in her own world. But things had been different lately. I can't put my finger on exactly when it started, but there were little signs, subtle hints that something wasn't right. She'd gotten quieter, more distant. She'd stopped asking about my day, barely even noticed when I left in the mornings or came back late at night. And there were nights she'd stay up late, much later than usual, claiming she was working on a new project with a tight deadline. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. I brushed it off as stress, maybe even boredom. I mean, who wouldn't get bored being alone all day while their spouse is away? But still, there were moments. Moments when I caught a flicker of something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite decipher, like the time she left her phone out, screen up with a text notification from an unknown number that quickly disappeared before I could read it. Or when she'd abruptly hang up a call the second I entered the room, then smile too quickly, too brightly, like nothing was out of the ordinary. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe I was just projecting my own exhaustion, my own guilt for being away so often, onto her. But then, a few weeks ago, I found a single red lace thong that wasn't hers. At least, I hadn't seen her wear it before. When I asked, she laughed it off, said it was a new purchase. I wanted to believe her, but a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. So here I was, back home after 2 long weeks, exhausted, eager to feel her arms around me, to let everything else fade away, just for a little while. I unlocked the door and stepped into the darkened hallway, the familiar scent of home greeting me. I dropped my bags at the entrance and walked towards the living room, my steps slow and heavy. And then, I saw her. Sarah was sitting on the couch, sprawled out in a way that seemed almost deliberate, like she was waiting for me. Or maybe for someone else. She wore a lace bra and panties, blood red, the kind you see in magazines, not the kind you wear for comfort on a regular Wednesday night. Her hair was tousled, falling messily around her shoulders, and there was a faint flush in her cheeks, the kind that came from one too many glasses of wine. And there, in her right hand, was a glass of Merlot, half empty. In her left, a bowl of half-melted ice cream. It was a sight that should have thrilled me, a seductive surprise after a long absence. But something was off. The way she looked at me, half-dazed, her eyes glinting in the low light, a crooked smile on her lips, felt strange, like she was acting in a play where I wasn't given the script. "Honey, I'm glad that you greet me like this," I said, trying to shake off the unease, to step into the role I was supposed to play. I smiled, and she giggled, a sound that was almost too high-pitched, too carefree. I walked over, leaned down to kiss her, and there it was, a scent that didn't belong, a scent that made my skin crawl. It was musky, masculine, mixed with the smell of sweat and something else I couldn't place. I took a spoon from the bowl in her hand, trying to keep the smile on my face, trying to hold on to the illusion that this was normal, that this was just a weird, flirty surprise after my time away. But as I tasted the ice cream, I noticed another flavor mixed in. A bitter, metallic tang that didn't belong. I looked at her, and her smile faltered just for a split second, a flash of something that looked almost like panic crossing her face. "Sarah," I began, my voice catching in my throat. "What's in this?" She blinked at me, her smile still frozen in place, and then she laughed. "Oh, just a little something extra. I thought you'd like it." Her words slurred slightly, and I realized then that she wasn't just tipsy, she was drunk. But there was something else, something deeper than alcohol in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, of something hidden. I glanced around the room, my mind racing, piecing together the strangeness of it all, the discarded shirt on the floor that wasn't mine, the way her gaze kept darting towards the hallway, like she was waiting for something, or someone, to appear. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "Sarah, what's going on?" I asked, my voice sharper now, the words cutting through the thick, uncomfortable air. She giggled again, but this time there was an edge to it, a tremor that betrayed her. "Nothing, baby. Just happy to see you." But her eyes told a different story, a story I wasn't ready to hear, a truth I wasn't prepared to face. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tight, my head spinning with the mix of exhaustion and suspicion. I felt the taste again, the bitter, strange aftertaste of something wrong, something hidden. My chest tightened, my vision blurred. Suddenly I couldn't breathe. My hand flew to my throat and I stumbled back, gasping for air. "Sarah, what did you do?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. Her face went pale, the smile disappearing in an instant. "Oh my God, David. David, I didn't mean..." And then, everything went black. When I came to, my head was pounding like a drum. My throat burned, and there was a sour taste in my mouth that made me want to retch. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of where I was. I was still on the floor, half sprawled, my back against the base of the couch. I felt a throbbing pain in my chest, and my breathing was shallow, ragged. Sarah was crouched beside me, her face close, her hands gripping my shoulders too tight. Her eyes were wide, filled with something like terror. "David! David, are you okay?" she whispered frantically, shaking me slightly like I was a doll she was trying to wake from a nightmare. I blinked again, my vision slowly clearing. What the hell happened?" I croaked, my voice barely more than a rasp. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the hallway again and then back to me. You passed out. I think you're allergic to something in the ice cream," she said, her voice shaky, unsteady. "Allergic?" I muttered, trying to wrap my head around her words, trying to shake off the fog that clouded my thoughts. I didn't have any allergies. I knew that much. And there was still that smell. Faint now, but unmistakable. Male hormones, the scent of another man in our house, mixed with the perfume of her body and sweat. And then it hit me. A memory. A flash of something I had seen just before I blacked out. The shirt on the floor. Not mine. A man's shirt, wrinkled and half hidden behind the chair. My heart began to race again, adrenaline surging through my veins, clearing the fog from my mind. I sat up too quickly, and the room tilted for a moment before it settled. "Sarah," I said, my voice low, deadly calm. "Whose shirt is that?" I pointed towards the shirt on the floor, my hand trembling with barely restrained fury. She froze, her eyes widening, a slight gasp escaping her lips. For a split second, she looked like a deer caught in headlights, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. And then, as if realizing there was no escape, no more lies to hide behind, her face hardened. She straightened her back, her hands falling away from my shoulders. It's not what you think, David," she started, but her voice lacked conviction. There was a tremor in it, a desperation I'd never heard before. "Not what I think," I snapped, the words spilling out of me, raw and jagged. "Sarah, whose shirt is that? And why does this whole damn place smell like someone else?" She looked down, her shoulders slumping, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But when she lifted her head, there was a strange defiance in her eyes, a challenge that sent a chill down my spine. "David, I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice a mix of guilt and something else. Relief, maybe. "There's someone else." My heart stopped. I felt it in my chest, like a fist squeezing around my ribcage, crushing the air out of me. I stared at her, my mouth dry, my head spinning. "Someone else?" I repeated, barely recognizing my own voice. She nodded, swallowing hard, tears welling up in her eyes now, but she didn't look away. "His name is Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "We've been seeing each other for a few months now." Months. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud, choking me. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, my breath coming in short, painful bursts. "While I've been away? While I've been working my ass off to keep us going, you've been with him?" She flinched at the venom in my words, but she didn't deny it. "I'm sorry, David," she whispered, her voice breaking. I never meant for it to happen like this." I laughed then, a short, harsh bark that sounded more like a sob. "Like this? You didn't mean for it to happen like this? You mean you didn't mean to get caught?" I spat, my hands clenching into fists. She looked down, a tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, and I could hear the pain in her voice, but it felt hollow, empty, like an excuse, like a lie. The room seemed to spin again, my heart pounding in my ears, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 questions. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the hallway, a shadow, a figure stepping forward, and there he was, Mark, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair disheveled, his shirt half-buttoned, and a smug grin on his face that made my blood boil. He looked at me, his eyes dark and challenging, and I knew in that instant that everything was about to change. The room grew cold. A chill that had nothing to do with the open window ran through me, seeping into my bones. Mark stood there, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, appraising me like a predator sizing up his prey. He was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, with a ruggedness that made him look like he belonged in an action movie rather than in my home. I couldn't look away. My vision tunneled, locking onto his smug expression, the faint upturn of his lips, the way he seemed to be daring me to make the first move. The anger inside me, that had been simmering, suddenly roared into a full blaze. I got up from the floor, feeling a surge of energy I didn't know I had, my fists clenching by my sides. "You son of a bitch!" I snarled, stepping toward him. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Mark's smile widened, a grin that was more infuriating than any words he could have said. "Relax, David," he replied, his voice smooth and condescending. "I didn't know you'd be home so soon." That was it. The casual arrogance, the way he acted like he belonged here, in my living room with my wife. I lunged at him, but Sarah quickly stepped between us, her hands on my chest, pushing me back with surprising strength. "David, stop!" she cried, panic flooding her voice. "Please, don't do this!" "Don't do this?" I shouted, incredulous. "You brought him into our home, Sarah. Into our bed, for God's sake." Mark didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, watching, waiting, that damned smirk still plastered on his face. Sarah's hands tightened on my chest and I could feel her shaking. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the fear in her eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of what would happen next. Fear of the truth that could no longer be hidden. "Get out of my way, Sarah," I growled. but she only pressed harder, her voice pleading. David, please, don't make this worse. Worse? I laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh that felt like acid on my tongue. How could it get any worse, Sarah? You've been screwing him behind my back for months. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman who used to look at me like I was her world. But then the moment passed, and all I could see was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, someone who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. Mark finally spoke again, his voice calm, as if he were discussing the weather. Look, David, I think you should leave. This isn't your problem anymore. Not my problem? I exploded, rage consuming every rational thought. You think you can just waltz into my life and take what's mine? Sarah's face paled at my words, and she whispered almost to herself, David, please, let's talk about this. Let's talk? I shouted. There's nothing to talk about, Sarah, not anymore. I felt my hands shaking, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Mark took a step closer, his expression turning serious, his eyes narrowing. David, he said, I don't want to fight you, but if you don't calm down, I will defend myself. Defend himself. The words sent a fresh surge of fury through me. My vision blurred red, and before I knew it, I'd pushed past Sarah, my fist flying toward his face. He dodged to the side, quicker than I expected, and I stumbled, nearly losing my balance. I swung again, but he caught my wrist this time, his grip like iron. Stop this, he hissed, his voice low, threatening. You're only making it harder on yourself. I ripped my hand free, chest heaving, my mind racing. I could hear Sarah crying behind me, her sobs like knives cutting through the haze of my anger. Get the hell out of my house, I managed to say, my voice raw, my throat tight. Mark looked at me for a long moment, then nodded, his expression softening slightly. Fine, he said quietly. But this isn't over. He turned and walked to the door, pausing just long enough to give Sarah a look that sent another wave of nausea through me, a look filled with familiarity, with intimacy. Then he left, closing the door softly behind him, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. I stood there, breathing, hard, feeling the silence settle around me like a shroud. I turned to Sarah, who was sitting on the edge of the couch now, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but all I could do was stare, my mind numb, my body trembling, the enormity of her betrayal crashing over me in relentless waves. Why? I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. Why did you do it, Sarah? She looked up at me then, her eyes red and swollen, her face streaked with tears. And for the first time, I saw the truth in them, the guilt, the regret, and something else, something darker, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I don't know, she said softly, her voice breaking. I don't know, David. I'm sorry. But sorry wasn't enough. Not now. Not ever. I stood there, feeling the cold seep into my bones, trying to understand what had just happened. The room felt like a stranger's, a place I no longer recognized. The furniture seemed oddly placed, the light too harsh, the walls pressing in on me like they were alive, closing in, inch by inch. Sarah sat on the couch, her shoulders slumped, her face buried in her hands. Her sobs were quieter now, almost muffled, but each one sent a knife of pain through me, cutting deeper than the last. I should have felt something, pity, sympathy, even rage. But all I felt was a numb emptiness, like someone had hollowed me out and left me to drift in a sea of confusion. I wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, to make her hurt the way I was hurting, but instead, I just stood there, my fists clenching and unclenching at my sides, my mind racing with 1,000 questions, none of which I knew how to ask. Finally, I forced myself to speak. Sarah, I began, my voice low, strained. How long has this been going on? She didn't look up at first, just wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took a shuddering breath. When she finally did meet my gaze, her eyes were red, her face pale, but there was something else there too, something like resignation. "A few months," she whispered, almost too softly for me to hear. "It started a few months ago." "A few months," I repeated, feeling a fresh wave of nausea roll through me. How could you? How could you look me in the eyes every day and lie to me like that?" She shook her head, more tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know, David. I don't know how it happened. It just did." I laughed, a short, bitter sound that felt like it was being ripped from my throat. "It just happened? Are you kidding me, Sarah? People don't just fall into bed with someone else. That's not how it works." She flinched, and for a moment I thought she might lash out, defend herself. But then her shoulders sagged, and she nodded, a broken, defeated motion. "You're right," she murmured. "It doesn't just happen. I chose it, David. I chose to be with him." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered back a step, feeling the ground shift beneath me. "Why, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why him?" "Why, at all?" She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know," she said again, her voice trembling. Maybe I was lonely. Maybe I was tired of waiting for you to come home every night, tired of feeling like I didn't matter." "Tired of waiting?" I shot back, anger flaring again. "Do you think I wanted to be away? Do you think I liked spending nights in hotel rooms eating takeout missing you? I was doing it for us, Sarah. For you." Her face crumpled, more tears spilling down. "I know, David. I know," she sobbed. "But it didn't feel like that. It felt like you were leaving me behind. Like you were always somewhere else." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure, but it was slipping through my fingers like sand. "And what about him?" I asked, my voice harsh. "What did he give you that I couldn't?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite read. He was here," she said finally. "He was here when you weren't. He made me feel seen, David, like I was important." "Important?" I repeated, feeling the word like a slap in the face. "And what about us, Sarah? What about the life we built together? Wasn't that important enough?" She closed her eyes as if trying to shut out my words, my pain. "It was," she whispered. "It was, but I lost sight of it. I got lost, David. I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it, Sarah. You've torn apart everything we had. Everything." She broke down then, sobs racking her body, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. I wanted to comfort her, to reach out and hold her, but my hands stayed by my sides, heavy, immovable. I couldn't touch her. Not now. Not like this. I turned away, unable to look at her any longer, my mind spinning with everything she'd said, everything I'd just learned. How had I missed it? How had I not seen the signs? The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the excuses. They all flashed before me now. Pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to put together. I felt something inside me break, a final snap, a clean cut severing the last thread of whatever held us together. And I knew then that nothing would ever be the same again. Not between us. Not in this house. Not in my life. I needed to get out. I needed air, space, something. Anything but this suffocating room, this unbearable truth. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps heavy, my body trembling with the effort to hold myself together. "David!" Sarah called after me, her voice broken, pleading. "Please, don't go!" But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I opened the door, stepped out into the cold night, and let it slam shut behind me. The sound echoed in the quiet street, loud and final. I stood there breathing hard, feeling the chill of the night air on my skin, the darkness pressing in around me. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, utterly lost. The cold air hit me like a slap, a shock to my system that momentarily cleared my head. I stumbled down the front steps, feeling the unevenness of each step beneath my feet, my vision blurring with tears I refused to shed. I needed to get away, to think, to breathe. I needed to make sense of the chaos that had just turned my life upside down. I reached the end of the driveway and leaned against my car, my hands gripping the cold metal hood like it was the only thing keeping me upright. My heart was still racing, my mind still replaying Sarah's words over and over. A few months, lonely, seen, important. Words that now felt like a knife twisting deeper with each repetition. I glanced back at the house. The light from the living room window spilled out onto the lawn, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me, taunting me, daring me to go back in. I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I looked down at my phone, my hands trembling as I scrolled through my contacts. Who could I call? Who would understand? Most of my friends were mutuals, people who knew Sarah as well as they knew me. The last thing I needed was their pity, their well-meaning attempts to patch things up, to tell me it was just a mistake, that we could work through it. But this wasn't something you worked through. This was a wound that would never heal. My thumb hovered over Jake's number. My oldest friend, the one person who would understand without asking a million questions, who would pour me a drink and let me rage and cry without judgment. I hit call, the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the dial tone, each ring dragging out longer and longer, until finally, he answered. "Hey, man," Jake's voice came through, casual, upbeat, like he had no idea his world was about to be dragged into my mess. "What's up?" I swallowed, trying to steady my voice, trying to sound normal, but it came out cracked, broken. "Jake, I need to talk. Can I come over?" There was a pause on the other end, and then his tone shifted, serious, concerned. "Yeah, of course. Everything okay?" I let out a bitter laugh, one that tasted like bile. "No, not even close." "Come over," he said quickly, his voice firm. "I'll be here. We'll figure it out." I nodded, forgetting he couldn't see me. "Thanks," I muttered, hanging up and sliding into the driver's seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I started the engine, the roar of it filling the silence, a small comfort in its familiarity. I pulled out of the driveway, my tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement, and headed towards Jake's place, my mind spinning. The drive was a blur of streetlights and dark roads, my thoughts colliding like cars on ice. I couldn't stop thinking about Mark. His smug face, his calm demeanor, the way he'd looked at me like I was the intruder, like I was the one who didn't belong. And Sarah, the way she'd defended him, the way she'd looked at me with a mix of guilt and something else, something like regret, but not quite. What did he have that I didn't? What did he give her that I hadn't? The questions clawed at me, tearing at my insides. I wanted to scream, to shout, to hit something, anything to make this pain go away, even if just for a moment. I reached Jake's place faster than I expected, pulling into his driveway and killing the engine. His house was dark except for a light in the living room, a faint glow that seemed like a beacon in the night. I got out of the car and walked to the door, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. Before I could knock, the door swung open, and there was Jake, his face etched with concern, his brow furrowed in worry. "Jesus, David," he muttered, pulling me into a tight hug. "What the hell happened?" I stood there, stiff, unyielding, and then something inside me broke. The tears I'd been holding back spilled out, and I collapsed against him, my body shaking with sobs I couldn't control. He held me there, not saying a word, just letting me cry, letting me get it all out. Finally, when I'd calmed down enough to speak, He guided me to the couch, handed me a drink, and sat down across from me, his eyes searching my face. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about coming home, about finding Sarah in her lace underwear, about the strange taste, the way I'd felt myself losing consciousness. I told him about Mark, about the confrontation, about everything Sarah had said. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, raw and jagged, as if I was purging them from my body. When I finished, Jake just sat there, silent, absorbing it all. Then he shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "I'm so sorry, man," he said, his voice low. I don't even know what to say." "I don't need you to say anything," I replied, my voice flat, hollow. "I just needed someone to know." He nodded, reaching over to squeeze my shoulder. "I'm here, David. Whatever you need, I'm here." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything hanging heavy between us. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "What are you going to do?" I shrugged, feeling the tears well up again, but I forced them back. "I don't know," I whispered. "I really don't know." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Well, whatever happens, you're not alone in this, okay? We'll get through it. One way or another." I nodded, grateful for his words, even if I didn't quite believe them. "Thanks, Jake," I muttered. And for a moment, I felt a flicker of something. Maybe hope, maybe just the comfort of knowing someone else was in my corner. But as quickly as it came, it vanished, replaced by the cold, hard truth that nothing would ever be the same again. I spent the night at Jake's place, tossing and turning on his uncomfortable couch. Sleep was a distant dream, lost in the whirlwind of thoughts that refused to quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face, that smug grin, the way he looked at me as if I was the interloper in my own life. I heard Sarah's voice, pleading, her words circling in my mind like a broken record. "I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry." But sorry didn't change anything. Sorry wouldn't undo the betrayal, wouldn't erase the image of them together, wouldn't fix what was now shattered beyond repair. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling a numbness creep over me, spreading through my limbs like frostbite. Around dawn, I gave up on the idea of sleep. I sat up, my back aching from the lumpy cushions, and glanced around Jake's living room. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. I could hear the faint sound of traffic from the street outside, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Normal, everyday sounds that felt alien to me now, as if I'd been thrust into a different world. I needed to do something, anything, to stop my mind from spiraling further into the darkness. I got up, walked to the kitchen, and made a pot of coffee. The ritual was calming, familiar. I watched the dark liquid drip into the pot, the steam rising in delicate swirls, and for a moment, I felt a sense of clarity, a small sliver of normalcy in the chaos. Jake walked in, rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking up at odd angles. "You're up early," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Didn't sleep much," I replied, pouring us both a cup of coffee. "Couldn't stop thinking." He nodded, taking the cup from my hand and sipping it slowly. "Yeah, I figured. You've got a lot on your mind." I shrugged, trying to keep my emotions in check. "What the hell am I going to do, Jake?" He leaned against the counter, his expression serious. "You need to confront this, David. You can't just run away from it. You need answers. Closure." "Closure?" I scoffed, setting my cup down a little too hard. "What closure could there possibly be? My wife has been sleeping with another man. What more is there to say?" Jake didn't flinch. "You need to know why, man. You need to understand. Otherwise, it's just going to eat away at you." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "And what if there isn't a why, Jake? What if it's just something she wanted?" He shook his head slowly. There's always a why, David. You might not like it, but there's a reason. You've got to find it, or you'll never move on. Move on. The words felt hollow, like a distant dream I wasn't sure I'd ever reach. But he was right. I couldn't just sit here, wallowing in misery. I needed to confront Sarah. I needed to hear the truth from her own lips, no matter how much it hurt. I finished my coffee, set the cup down, and grabbed my jacket. I'm going to talk to her, I said, my voice steady, determined. Jake nodded, a hint of relief in his eyes. Good. Just take it easy, all right? Don't do anything stupid. I forced a smile. No promises, I replied, heading for the door. The drive back home was a blur. My mind raced with a million thoughts, 1,000 possibilities, each one more painful than the last. What if she wanted to leave me for him? What if this had been going on longer than she admitted? What if she never loved me at all? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts, trying to focus on what I needed to say, what I needed to ask. When I pulled into the driveway, my hands were shaking. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and walked to the front door. It was quiet inside, too quiet. I stepped into the living room and saw Sarah sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up as I entered, a mixture of fear and guilt in her gaze. "David," she began, but I cut her off, raising a hand. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not here for more apologies. I'm here for the truth." She swallowed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Okay," she whispered. "Ask me anything." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why, Sarah?" I asked, my voice raw, desperate. "Why did you do it? Why did you betray me?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know, David," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I was lost. I felt like I was disappearing, like I was just your wife, nothing more." I stared at her, my jaw clenched. "My wife? You are my wife. You chose to be my wife. How does that justify what you did?" Her eyes filled with tears again. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she pleaded. It started so innocently. He was just a friend, someone to talk to. But then, things changed. I don't know how, but they did." I shook my head, disbelief flooding me. "You expect me to believe that? That it just happened?" "No," she said, her voice a whisper. "I don't expect you to believe anything. I don't know if I even believe it myself." The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. "So, what now, Sarah?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Do you want him? Is that it?" She looked up at me, her face a mask of pain. "I don't know," she admitted, and that, more than anything, shattered what was left of my heart. Her words hung in the air like smoke, choking me, filling the room with a heaviness I could barely stand. "I don't know." She didn't know if she wanted him. She didn't know if she wanted me. She didn't know what the hell she wanted, and yet, here I was, standing in front of her, my life upended, my heart torn apart, and she didn't have a damn answer. My hands trembled as I gripped the back of the chair, the only thing keeping me from lunging toward her, from shaking her, demanding a truth I wasn't sure she even understood. I tried to steady my breathing, to think clearly, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears, a roaring tide that drowned out everything else. "You don't know?" I repeated, my voice low, dangerous. "How can you not know, Sarah? How can you sit there and tell me you don't know?" She flinched, looking down at her hands, her fingers twisting around each other as if they were trying to strangle the words she didn't want to say. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking, I never meant to hurt you." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "Never meant to hurt me? You've been screwing another man in our house, in our bed, And you say you never meant to hurt me? What did you think was going to happen, Sarah? She broke down then, sobs racking her body, her shoulders shaking with the force of it. She buried her face in her hands, and I stood there, feeling a strange detachment settle over me. It was like I was watching this from a distance, like it was happening to someone else, some other poor bastard whose life had just crumbled to dust. I didn't think, she cried out, her voice muffled, choked with tears. I didn't think, David. I was stupid, I was selfish. I needed something. Something that wasn't this. Something that wasn't this? I snapped, my anger flaring again. What, Sarah? What did you need so badly that you had to destroy everything we built together? She looked up, her eyes swollen, red, filled with pain, and something else, something that looked like desperation. I needed to feel alive, she confessed, her voice a broken whisper. I needed to feel like I mattered. Like you mattered, I repeated, shaking my head. You mattered to me, Sarah. You were my world. She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't feel that way, she admitted, her voice cracking. I felt lost, invisible. You were always gone, always working, and I felt like I was fading away. And then, Mark, he was there, and I cut her off, my voice cold. He what? Made you feel alive? Made you feel special? She nodded, biting her lip, more tears falling. Yes, she whispered, ashamed. He made me feel seen, David. He made me feel wanted. I felt something inside me snap, a final thread that held me tethered to reason, to control. And what about me? I shouted, my voice rising. I wanted you. Sarah, I still do. But that wasn't enough, was it? You needed more. You needed him. She looked down, unable to meet my gaze, and I knew then that I'd lost her, that whatever we had, whatever we were, was gone, torn apart by her need, by her choices. I felt a wave of despair crash over me, a pain so deep it felt like it might swallow me whole. I turned away, running a hand through my hair, trying to catch my breath, trying to hold on to something, anything that felt solid, real. What now? I asked, my voice flat, empty. What the hell do we do now, Sarah? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, like she was afraid of the words she was about to say. Maybe we need some time apart, she suggested, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. Time apart? I repeated, feeling a cold fury rise in me. You think that's going to fix this? You think space is going to make this better? She shook her head, her face pale, stricken. I don't know, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what else to do. I felt a hollow laugh escape me, a sound that was more like a sob. You don't know? I muttered, shaking my head. You don't know what to do, so you just want to run away? Like that's going to solve anything? She started crying harder, her body shaking, and for a moment I felt a surge of guilt. But I pushed it down, buried it beneath the anger, the betrayal. Fine, I said, my voice hard. You want space? You've got it. I grabbed my keys from the table, my hands shaking. But don't think for a second that this makes it okay, I warned, my voice low, dangerous. Don't think for a second that I'll just forgive and forget. She didn't reply, just sat there, sobbing quietly, her hands trembling in her lap. I turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind me, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a gunshot. I stood on the porch, breathing hard, feeling the cool air hit my skin, and for the first time, I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I wiped it away angrily, refusing to break, refusing to let her see me fall apart. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was already broken. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind a tangled mess of anger, hurt, and confusion. The city seemed different in the early morning light, like it was mocking me, showing me a world that was moving on without me, while mine had come to a screeching halt. I passed familiar places, restaurants where Sarah and I used to eat, the park where we'd had our first date, the corner where we'd kissed in the rain, both of us soaked but laughing, happy, unaware of the storm that lay ahead. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to do anything that would dull the sharp, relentless pain in my chest. My thoughts kept drifting back to her face, her tear-streaked cheeks, the way her voice had trembled when she admitted she didn't know what she wanted. It was like a knife twisting deeper, cutting through the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. I stopped at a red light and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I barely recognized the man looking back at me, his eyes red and swollen, his face pale and drawn, lines of pain etched deep into his skin. I felt like I'd aged 10 years in a single night. The light turned green, but I didn't move. A car honked behind me, and I snapped out of my daze, pressing the gas and moving forward. But I had no destination, no plan, just the unbearable need to keep going, to outrun the memories, the betrayal, the loss. Eventually, I found myself at a bar, a dive on the edge of town, the kind of place you go when you want to disappear. I pulled into the parking lot, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Then, without thinking, I got out, slammed the car door, and walked inside. The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and smoke. A few early drinkers sat at the counter, hunched over their glasses, lost in their own worlds. I made my way to a corner booth and sat down, my hands trembling as I signaled to the bartender. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice gruff, his eyes barely glancing up from the glass he was cleaning. "Whiskey," I replied, my voice hoarse. "Keep it coming." He nodded and poured a generous amount, sliding the glass toward me. I downed it in one gulp, relishing the burn, the way it seared down my throat, momentarily distracting me from the pain in my chest. I slammed the glass down and nodded for another. The bartender raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, just poured another shot. I drank it slower this time, feeling the warmth spread through my veins, dulling the edges of my thoughts, blurring the sharpness of reality. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, how many drinks I had. Time seemed to slip away, lost in the haze of alcohol and my own spiraling thoughts. I felt numb, detached, like I was watching my life from the outside, a spectator to my own destruction. I kept drinking, kept trying to fill the emptiness with something, anything that might make me forget, even if just for a little while. But the alcohol didn't help. It only made everything worse, sharpening the pain, the betrayal, the image of Sarah in her lace underwear, waiting for him, not me. At some point, a man slid into the seat across from me. I looked up, blinking through the haze, and recognized him, Mark. I felt a surge of rage, my hands clenching into fists, ready to lunge across the table, but he held up his hands, a smirk playing on his lips. 8. "Easy, David," he said, his voice calm, too calm. "I just want to talk." "Talk?" I spat, my voice slurred, thick with alcohol and anger. "You think we have anything to talk about?" He shrugged, still smiling that infuriating smile. "I think we do. You need to understand, David, it was never personal." "Not personal?" I growled, leaning forward, my fists trembling with the effort to keep myself from attacking him. "You fucked my wife, Mark, in my house. How the hell is that not personal?" He sighed, his expression turning almost sympathetic. "Look, I get it. You're angry. You should be. But you need to understand, this isn't about you. It's about her." I stared at him, incredulous. "Her?" He nodded. "Sarah needed something, David. Something you couldn't give her, something I could." I felt my heart twist, a fresh wave of pain crashing over me. What the hell are you talking about? I snapped, my voice barely more than a whisper. She needed to feel alive, he replied, his tone almost gentle. She needed someone who could be there, who could give her the attention she craved. You were always gone, always distracted. You left her alone, and she found comfort somewhere else. I slammed my hand down on the table, making the glasses jump. Don't you dare try to justify what you did, I growled. You had no right. He nodded slowly. Maybe not, he admitted. But it happened, and now you have to decide what you're going to do. What I'm going to do? I repeated, feeling the alcohol buzz in my veins, mixing with my anger, making my head spin. I'm going to make you pay for what you've done. He shook his head, his smile fading. No, David, that's not going to help. It's only going to make things worse. I leaned back, feeling the weight of his words, the truth in them. But I wasn't ready to let go. Wasn't ready to admit defeat. What the hell do you know? I muttered. He stood up, looking down at me, his expression serious. I know that you're hurting, he said quietly, and I know that you need to figure out what you want, what you need, because until you do, this is never going to end. I watched him walk away, his words echoing in my mind. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to tear the place apart, but all I could do was sit there, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me, drowning me in a sea of confusion and pain. And I knew, deep down, that he was right. I needed to figure out what came next. I don't remember much about the drive back home, just that it felt like an eternity, each mile stretching out like an endless road to nowhere. My hands were gripping the wheel so tight that my knuckles ached. My mind was racing, bouncing between anger, sorrow, and a hollow, aching emptiness I couldn't shake. I pulled into the driveway, the house looming in front of me, dark and silent. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the front door, wondering if I even had the strength to go inside, wondering if I wanted to, but I knew I had to face it, to face her, and whatever truth lay waiting for me inside. I pushed the door open and stepped into the house. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me, suffocating. I walked through the darkened living room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. When I reached the kitchen, I found her sitting at the table, a bottle of wine in front of her, a half-empty glass in her hand. She looked up as I entered, her eyes bloodshot, her face pale, a tear-streaked mess. "David," she whispered, her voice barely more than a croak, "I didn't think you'd come back." "Neither did I replied, my voice flat, emotionless. She tried to smile, but it faltered, breaking apart into a sob. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I keep saying that, but I don't know what else to say." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms, keeping my distance. "I didn't come back for apologies, Sarah," I said quietly. "I came back for answers." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'll try," she whispered. "I'll try to tell you everything." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady, calm. "Do you love him?" I asked, the question that had been tearing me apart since the moment I saw them together. She hesitated, her eyes darting away from mine. "No," she said finally. "I don't love him, David. I never did." "Then why?" I pressed, feeling my anger flare. "Why him? Why at all?" She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "Because he made me feel something," she admitted, her voice breaking. "He made me feel alive, like I mattered. And I was so lonely, David. You were always gone, and I felt like I was disappearing." I felt my chest tighten, a wave of anger and sadness crashing over me. "So, you found someone else to make you feel better?" I snapped. "Someone to make you feel alive?" She flinched, more tears spilling down her cheeks. I know it was wrong, she sobbed. I know I hurt you, but I didn't know how else to fix what was broken. I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. What was broken, Sarah? Us? Or just you? She broke down then, her sobs filling the room, her shoulders shaking. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but I couldn't. I couldn't get past the betrayal, the pain. We stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between us like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. Finally, she looked up, wiping her tears, and took a deep breath. David, there's something else I need to tell you, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. I felt a chill run down my spine, my heart pounding in my chest. What? I demanded. What else could there possibly be? She hesitated, her face crumpling, and then she spoke, the words coming out in a rush. I'm pregnant. The room seemed to tilt, my vision blurring. Pregnant? I repeated, my voice cracking. You're pregnant? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, she whispered. And it's not yours, David. It's his. For a moment, everything went silent, the world dropping away beneath me. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, the air knocked out of me. I stumbled back, grabbing the counter to steady myself, my mind reeling, my heart breaking all over again. You're pregnant with his child? I whispered, barely able to get the words out. She nodded, sobbing uncontrollably now. I'm so sorry, David, she cried. I didn't know this would happen. I felt a surge of rage, a white-hot fury that threatened to consume me. How could you? I shouted, my voice raw, filled with pain. How could you do this to us? To me? I didn't mean for this to happen, she pleaded, reaching out to me, but I pulled away, unable to bear her touch. I didn't. I was scared. I was confused. I never wanted it to go this far. I shook my head, disbelief and anger warring within me. You've destroyed everything, I said, my voice trembling. Everything we had, everything we were. It's all gone now. She fell to her knees, her sobs echoing through the room. I'm sorry, David, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I turned away, unable to look at her, feeling the weight of her betrayal like a knife in my heart. I can't do this, I muttered, my voice flat, numb. I can't be here. Not anymore. I grabbed my keys, my hands shaking, and walked to the door. She called after me, her voice desperate, pleading. David, please. Don't leave. Please. But I didn't stop. I stepped outside, slamming the door behind me, the sound echoing in the quiet night. I stood on the porch, breathing hard, feeling the cold air hit my skin, the darkness pressing in around me. I knew this was it, the end of everything we'd built, the life we'd made together. I was leaving it all behind, her, our home, our dreams. I walked to my car, got in, and drove away, the tears finally falling, hot and bitter on my cheeks. And as I drove, I realized something. Some things can't be fixed, some wounds never heal, and this was one of them, the end.